In both of his past elections, Trump never managed to win the popular vote despite his electoral victory that made him president in 2016. In that election, he lost to Clinton by about 3 million total votes, and then in 2020 he lost to Biden by around 7 million total votes. Currently, Harris leads Trump nationally by a margin of plus 0.5, according to RCP's most recent polling average. But polls have underestimated Trump in the past. Looking back to 2020, he lost by a margin of 4.5 percentage points, and even though he is down now, he is performing a whole 4 points better than he did last cycle. In this video, we are going to fill out a 2024 electoral map based on one possible scenario where Trump manages to shift the nation 4 points to the right, winning the popular vote for the first time in his political career. So let's get started. We are going to start this map with each candidate's safe states. These states, regardless of the 4-point shift, still are almost guaranteed to vote for their preferred candidate. Remember, for our map, 1 to 3% is tilt, 3 to 7% is lean, 7 to 12% is likely, and anything greater than 12 percentage points fall under this safe category and become our deepest shades of red and blue. As I'm sure you expected, a 4-point shift in Trump's favor knocks a few of Harris's solid blue states off her list. However, according to the latest polls, she still manages to win the Aloha state of Hawaii, as well as California, and over in the Northeast, Vermont, Massachusetts, Maryland, and D.C. This gives the current vice president just under 100 total votes and a long way away from winning the election. As for Trump, his list of safe states is a lot longer. According to the most recent polls, Trump is sure to win Alaska, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota, Nebraska at large, as well as its 1st and 3rd congressional districts, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, and Maine's 2nd congressional district. These states already put Trump ahead of Harris, but these are just the states he is usually expected to win. In the scenario we are looking at today, Trump can add Texas in the south and Iowa and Ohio further north. With Trump holding a substantial lead as we get into the less secure states politically, it's important to note that the way we are calculating our map is just by taking the most recent polls in these states and just shifting the margin shown by 4 points. Moving on to each candidate's likely states, these are the states that show margins of 7 to 12 points after our shift and favor one candidate way more than the other. Starting off with Kamala Harris, yet again, her first safe turned likely state is Washington. Usually the entire coast is solid blue, just like with California, but when we shift the most recent polls, these states get a lot closer, especially Oregon. But more on that later. The most recent poll in Washington shows Harris ahead by a solid plus 14 over Trump. But when we apply our universal shift, it drops to a slightly less blue plus 10, making Washington our first likely Democrat state. The other two states that got demoted are over on the East Coast with New York and Delaware. Like most of this region, these two states are usually solid blue, voting for Biden in 2020 by margins of plus 23 and plus 19. In New York, the most recent poll shows Harris ahead by the usual minimum safe margin of plus 12 with 49% to 37%. When we shift this 4 points in Trump's favor, however, she only wins the Empire State by a margin of plus 8, making New York another likely Democrat state. And in Delaware, there haven't been any polls with Harris as of right now, mainly because most don't expect this state to shock anybody given its history. The most recent poll, however, shows Trump losing by a 11-point margin, which becomes just 7 points shifted. This puts Delaware on the border of becoming a lean state, but for now, we can make it likely in Harris's favor. Moving on to Trump's safe states, this is where things get very interesting. Starting us off is the Sunshine State of Florida. If you've been keeping up with the election at all, or politics in general, you'd know that Florida has seen one of the largest shifts to the right in recent years, especially when you compare it to what it looked like politically 20 years ago when it was one of the closest battleground states, only being decided by less than 1 percentage point. The most recent poll shows Trump winning Florida by a margin of plus 6, which becomes plus 10 in our scenario. Because of this, we can make Florida our first likely Republican state. Next up is North Carolina, a state that is usually considered one of this cycle's battleground states. The most recent poll shows Trump winning North Carolina by a margin of +3 with 44% to 41%. Despite being a battleground state, North Carolina voted for Trump in both 2016 and 2020, making it one of the only swing states to stick to their vote. And with these current margins, especially when we shift the +3 to +7, it seems like it'll continue to do so, making North Carolina a likely Trump state. And finishing off our likely red states is Virginia. The most shocking of these three on the list, in 2020, Virginia voted for Biden by a margin of +10.1. And even though Biden seemed like he was going to win by a similar margin when polling first started, Trump completely changed that. The most recent poll between Trump and Harris shows the former president winning by a lean margin of +4, which adjusted becomes +8. It'll be interesting to see what happens in polls for Virginia as we get closer to November, but for now, we can make it our last likely Republican state. Moving on to the long list of battleground states in a scenario like this. As of right now, much of the country is pretty sure about who they want to vote for since both candidates are polar opposites and just overall very polarizing. Because of this, just a handful of battleground states will actually decide who wins. In a scenario where Trump outperforms polls by 4 points and ends up winning the popular vote, a lot more states that are usually not considered battleground become battlegrounds. In the West, we have Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. Oregon, Colorado, and New Mexico usually favor Democrats in margins large enough to be considered likely or even safe, especially looking back to their 2020 margins where they all voted for Biden with at least double-digit margins. In Oregon, the most recent poll shows Harris only winning by a margin of +5 with 45% to 40%. In our scenario, however, this drops to just +1, making Oregon a tilt Democrat state. In Colorado, even though Harris doesn't have any polls yet, the most recent poll shows Biden winning by a likely margin of +10. When we adjust it, however, Colorado becomes a lean Democrat state with +6. And just south of Colorado in New Mexico, the most recent poll from Redfield and Wilton Strategies shows Harris ahead with a barely likely margin of +7. Just like with Colorado, when we adjust it, New Mexico becomes a lean blue state with +3. Unlike these other three states we just covered, Nevada and Arizona are both considered actual battleground states, with the former voting for Biden in 2020 by a margin of +2.4 and the latter flipping from Trump in that same election by a margin of 0.31. The most recent poll in Nevada shows both Trump and Harris at a tie, with 40% to 40%. This would usually make it a toss-up state. If we adjust this tie to a +4 Trump margin, Republicans win Nevada by a lean margin. In Arizona, the most recent poll shows Harris winning by a tilt margin of +1, according to the series of polls recently conducted from Redfield and Wilton Strategies. When we adjust this, however, Trump wins Arizona by a lean margin of +3, adding another 11 votes to his total tally. Finishing off the southern region of the nation is Georgia, the closest state of the 2020 election. 4 years ago, Biden barely managed to flip this usual Republican stronghold by a margin of just +0.24. The most recent poll shows Trump winning by a tilt margin of +2 with 46% to 44%. Democrats haven't been able to carry Georgia for almost 50 years, and it seems like Harris isn't going to be the person to change that, especially if Trump outperforms his poll for the third election in a row. With our adjustment, Georgia becomes a lean Republican state with a margin of +6. In the Midwest, we have some of the most important and most contested states of the entire election, with Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, Minnesota, Illinois, and in the Rust Belt, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Unlike the rest of solid red Republican Nebraska, its 2nd district is unique since its demographics have many college-aged kids, which is wildly different from the rest of the state. In 2020, it voted for Biden by a margin of +6.6 compared to the statewide level, where it voted for Trump by a margin of +19.1. The most recent poll shows both candidates at a tie with 42%. When we apply our shift, however, this district becomes another lean Trump vote. Minnesota and Illinois are similar in their politics, both being longtime blue states, but both seem to be closer than most expected, at least as of the making of this video. The most recent poll in Minnesota shows Harris winning by a lean margin of +5 with 46% to 41%. When we shift it 4 points to the right, though, Harris only wins Minnesota by a tilt margin of +1. I also want to quickly note that if either of these two states flip, most likely it'll be Minnesota, but with Harris's VP pick, we might see margins increase in her favor over the coming months. Just something to keep an eye on. In Illinois, the most recent poll from Emerson College shows Biden winning by a likely margin of +10. There aren't any polls with Harris in this state yet, but when we adjust this most recent poll, Democrats still win with a lean margin of +6. Wisconsin is the first state in this highly contested Rust Belt region. The most recent poll shows both Trump and Harris at another tie, with both getting 43%. In Michigan, the most recent poll shows Trump ahead by just +1 with 42 to 41%. And in Pennsylvania, the most recent poll shows Trump winning by a margin of +2 with 46% to 44%. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania have been very hard to predict since it seems like voters here are literally split down the middle. For now, though, all three become lean Republican states with their adjusted margins of +4, +5, and +6 respectively. Finishing up our map in the Northeast is our last chunk of states with Maine at large, as well as its first congressional district, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey. These states are usually solid blue according to most predictions, but with our scenario, things get a little more red. In Maine, at the statewide level, the most recent poll shows Harris winning by a likely margin of +9, and in its first district, Democrats win by a similar likely margin of +8. When we adjust both of these, however, they become +5 and +4, making both lean blue rather than likely. The most recent poll in New Hampshire shows Harris winning by a margin of +6 with 48% to 41%. Usually this would make New Hampshire lean in her favor, but when we shift it 4 points to the right, she wins by a tilt margin of +2. Rhode Island and Connecticut both have similar numbers with their most recent polls showing Democrats in the lead with likely margins of +7 and +9. When we adjust both of these to +3 and +5, it makes these two states lean in Harris's favor. And finally, in New Jersey, the most recent poll shows some shocking numbers. The poll from Coefficient puts Trump ahead of the Democratic candidate, Biden at the time, with a margin of +1. When we adjust this, Trump wins New Jersey by a lean margin of +5. With that, Trump wins the 2024 election on both the electoral stage and the popular one. But what do you think will happen? Is Trump being underestimated in the polls yet again? Will he end up winning the popular vote for the first time ever? Or will Kamala Harris win both? Let us know in the comments.